Hello and welcome everyone to the DC Dual Force podcast episode 2. Let's just hop right on into it. We got a lot of great topics to talk about today. So it's probably going to take me a lot of time. So let's not waste any more time and get into it. Wanted to start things off today with, a little bit more of light introduction things. We talked about a lot of the format of the podcast and how things are going to kind of be in flux moving forward. And one of those things I wanted to get feedback on is the frequency of the podcast. Right now, my plan is to release it around once per week, ranging probably on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. So the first thing I wanted to ask you guys, and I guess feedback in the comment section, or if you're listening on one of the other platforms, however you'd like to get in contact, is weekly a good cadence? Would you guys want it more often? I don't think more often is probably a good idea. Maybe less often, every 2 weeks. Especially during these beta times where there might not be so much news coming out. But I think weekly in general feels right to me, but I wanted to get everyone's feedback on that and see what you guys are thinking about that. I did just allude to it, but the podcast is also available now on some other platforms. I uploaded it onto Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, in addition to your normal YouTube viewing pleasure. So if you are someone who prefers to listen on a podcasting platform, the podcast is available on those 3 additional platforms. If there's any other popular platforms that I missed, let me know and I will work on getting it uploaded to those platforms. I'm pretty new to this. I don't listen to a ton of podcasts, and when I do, they're typically on YouTube, so I don't really know what the most common platforms are. But it's pretty easy to add them to new ones, so I can definitely do that if there is an appetite for another platform. And the final thing for the introductory portion of the podcast is I brought up the topic of a co-host last episode. That is still my intention. I don't want to do this by myself forever. But I think we're probably going to run through episode 4 or so with just me. So I can really kind of get a footing for the podcast. Kind of explore things out there of, do we want a permanent co-host? Do we want to rotate co-hosts on a weekly basis? Kind of get somebody new from the community in every week. I do like that idea. So we're going to kind of try and explore what the options are. While also just trying to make sure that I have time to work out the kinks in this before we start adding another variable to the equation. And I'm still very open to feedback on if we want a permanent co-host or rotating co-host or what the community thinks would be best. My biggest goal, though, is whatever platform that I do have, whether it's a small platform with 5 viewers or a gigantic platform with 50,000 viewers, I really want to continuously spotlight and highlight others in the community. I'm big on, rising tides raise all boats or something like that. So whatever happens with me in DC Dual Force, I want to try and use that platform to help other creators, whether that's other, YouTubers, other streamers, people who may make, fan websites, deck building sites, host tournaments. I want to try and support and help everyone grow in whatever big or small way I can. So whether we have a permanent co-host or not, I still think we want to have a pretty steady influx of guests on the show. So that's it for the introductory stuff. Let's get on into the real meat and potatoes of today's episode. And I would be remiss, and you guys would probably roast me to no end, if we did not start with what I'm going to call the August 1st Extravaganza. Now, if you're not super familiar, August 1st was originally the date that the, what are we going to call it? The pre-register event for the Steam and Epic Store was supposed to end, and depending on the number of pre-registers we got, we gained additional rewards all the way up to 15,000, I believe, where we would get a bunch of dedicated card backs. So I believe as of yesterday, we are over 12,000 out of the 15,000. And the devs are extending it an extra week to see if we can get those 3,000 additional pre-registers. But that's not where the significance of August 1st has come from. I believe there was also some other member of the development team that may have said in the Discord at some point that August 1st was when they were wanting to release some additional feature. It was never a confirmed date, and I think that was one of the only times we've heard from that developer. But also the internet being the way the internet is, it's incredibly dangerous to give the internet dates. And the reason for that is a lot of, let's not even say a lot, most people in the world do not work in software development. Um, in software development, dates they might as well not be real. Dates are hopes, they are prayers, they are best intentions. Don't get me wrong. If I'm working on something for work and I tell you I'll have it done in a week or two, that is my intention. But, things happen every single day, all the time, where priorities may shuffle, issues may be larger than they appear. Dates are fluid, and they should never be taken as fact unless 100% stated as fact, and even then, you still should not trust them. However, the internet does not work in software. So I cannot fully blame people where if they say or they hear a date, they expect that date is set in stone. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that we did have August 1st floated as a potential date, plus we had a hard date for the contest ending. And through the power of the internet and telephone and people, paraphrasing other people, August 1st kind of ballooned into this gigantic date. Where I believe even August 1st in general, the one developer who said they wanted to release something, I think it was just a monthly subscription. But just kind of the way the internet works, that August 1st date kind of ballooned into people expecting big bug fix patch notes, the store, a whole bunch of other features that I don't think was ever on the menu or frankly realistic. But again, I can't blame people because during this time period, we also kind of had radio silence from the developers. I don't blame the developers for this either. When I'm head down working on fixes or features or bugs or whatever, there's not a lot to update on besides, hey, I'm still working hard. Hey, I'm still working hard. And the flip side of that is if we had a developer in Discord every day saying, no new updates, still working on what we're working on, there's some people who would appreciate that, and that would probably be enough for them. But there's also other people who seeing that same update daily would probably just be a source of frustration for them. So I don't blame developers if they kind of just want to get their head down, fix or build whatever they're trying to do, and then release it when it's ready and announce it when it's ready. I do think on some level we need to find a middle ground in the future. And what I mean is the complete radio silence that's happened for the last couple weeks is probably not super productive for either side. But also the kind of current expectation of like constant updates daily is not realistic either, especially not from the development team. Maybe if they have, dedicated community resource that has some leeway, and even then, like the community resource would be able to talk more maybe on like a weekly basis. But I do think we need to find a middle ground between radio silence and kind of constant communication, kind of find some happy medium moving forward. So, August 1st was, let's say, a colorful day in the Discord. There's a lot of upset people expecting an update, and then when an update did not come, they were not super happy about it. And I will say, I think late last night, early this morning, depending on your time zones, we did hear from the developers basically saying they are working hard on bug fixes, and those are top priority at the moment, and they will have another update for us soon. I do agree with that approach because subscription or no subscription, the biggest issue facing the game at the moment is the amount of bugs and kind of critical bugs that are in the client right now. Newer players who join the game, they'll probably be annoyed by, lack of free-to-play progression or lack of other features. But the single biggest disruption to players as a whole, or the single biggest thing that could risk pushing a player away from the game right now, is the amount of bugs. So I'm glad to hear that is the top of their priority list. I'm glad that we at least got to hear from the developers yesterday, and I hope that the frequency at which we hear from them goes up at least a moderate amount moving forward, even if it is simply we're hard at work, this is still our top priority, I don't want specific dates because, like I said, you give a date, only bad things can happen. But just hearing from them more often, I think, would be good for everybody. Um, so we have survived August 1st. We have moved on. Today is August 2nd, maybe even August 3rd, depending on where in the world you live. And we've made it through that. We got our development update from the devs. And kind of the last thing that I want to say on this topic is this beta just went into open beta a couple weeks ago. My expectation, now this is not grounded in anything from the devs. I have no inside knowledge at any point. My expectation is that this open beta is going to be kind of a long-term affair. And what I mean by that is I easily could see this beta being 6+ months. I could even easily see this beta lasting more than a year. And that is to say that this beta is going to be a long journey. And not everybody wants to be involved in that kind of long beta journey. And if you don't want to be involved in that kind of long beta journey, it is completely fine for you to say, I don't want to currently hardcore engage in a game that is this early in beta and that has these issues. I'm going to take a break for a couple months and see how the game is then. And then check in, maybe it's better and you're going to stick at that point, or maybe it still needs some work and you take another break for, a couple weeks, another month or two. That is completely fine. Betas are not for everybody. And I think it's important as a player to identify, is the current state of the game something I can happily engage in? You have to kind of identify a couple things. Is the core game, the skeleton of the game, the bones of the game, is this something that I like? And I think a lot of people do like it. I think Dual Force is a pretty awesomely designed game and has a ton of potential. But also a lot of it at the moment is potential. It needs to be realized potential is part of that. So if you're the kind of person where you like the core idea of the game and you think it's something you're going to like in the future, but you don't want to wait through these bug fixes or you don't want to play through them, just take a little break. And if you're the other kind of person where you're fine with some growing pains, keep engaging. Games are supposed to be fun. And if there's something that brings you frustration or anger, don't do that to yourself. Life is annoying enough. But yeah, that's the August 1st extravaganza. We made it through. We have prevailed. We have moved forward. And that is a good thing. So now let's talk about some actual gameplay. I've got probably two topics planned, unless I ramble way too long on either one. The first thing I wanted to talk about today is leader health pools. Now, we talked a little bit about leader health pools in the previous episode in terms of my happiness that they are a balance knob that the developers can turn when they are trying to nerf or buff different leaders and don't necessarily want to touch their abilities, since something like adding or subtracting a charge is a massive, implication, whereas adding or subtracting a point or two of health still makes an impact, but not as gigantic of an impact. So leader health pools in general, I think, is something that they should continue to work on normalizing. And what I mean by that is, in general, I think the health total of leaders is in a pretty good spot. You have things like Doomsday that have, I think, 24 health because Doomsday is a slower leader. His ability is 4 charges. He is an attacking leader as well. And in general, it seems like the leaders that gain attack and swing into enemies have slightly more health on average than a similarly costed leader. But I do think that there's some things that are a little bit out of whack. For example, right now, Wonder Woman's health is at 21, which is, I believe, the second or third highest health total in the game. You have Doomsday at 24. I think Black Adam might be 22 or so. I don't know the exact hierarchy off the top of my head, but that's to say Wonder Woman is simultaneously probably the strongest leader in the game, but she also has close to the highest health total. And then you compare that comparatively to something like Batgirl, who does gain attack, and she only has 17 health. So Wonder Woman has 25% more health than Wonder Woman. despite being an additional extra charge. And don't get me wrong, Batgirl's leader ability is incredibly strong and one that, if did not break the game in closed beta, because I did not play in closed beta, if it didn't already break the game at some point, it's probably going to find a way to break the game at some point in the future. So I'm not saying that Batgirl is weak, but just comparatively in general, having a 25% health difference between one of the weaker leaders in the game and the strongest seems very odd. And that honestly is probably part of the reason why Batgirl's on the weaker side, is her ability is slightly slower. There's not a ton of awesome triggers for her redeploy, and she just has the lowest health total. But also, I think a good question, one that maybe we should be discussing or thinking about, is the idea of, should a leader that gets attack have more health on average? I know the kind of surface level logic is, if they are going to be swinging, they need a bit more health so that they are not just killing themselves. But my question is, should they? So something like Wonder Woman, or something like Batman, or, even to lesser extents, your Harleys, your Aquamans, Shazam and Green Lantern, they attack less often, but health is a resource in this game. Health is a resource in all card games. So I think if these leaders that have attack, especially the leaders that have 2 charge attacks where they can attack every other turn, I would almost argue that those types of leaders should have less health than average. And my reasoning for that is, especially in the context of 2 attack leaders, and I think you see this a little bit with Harley, but I think Harley's health total is slightly lower because of her draw versus her attack. But the tempo you're gaining, and this is going to lead into our second topic today, which is kind of tempo as a whole in Dual Force. The tempo that you're gaining, or just being able to, if you don't need the tempo, and be able to send that attack at your opponent's face every other turn, the amount of that value should be offset by something. And I think a good thing to think about to be that something would be, now obviously this is an extreme example, I'm not saying they should ever go that low, that's way too low, but just for the sake of argument and sake of laying out the example, let's say Batman and Wonder Woman had 15 health. Obviously, again, too low, I'm not saying they should make that change, but just to illustrate an example, if they had 15 health, every time one of those leaders goes to activate their attack, you have to really think about it as the player controlling Batman and Wonder Woman. Am I willing to sacrifice this amount of health to gain this tempo swing on the board attacking into this recruit? Right now, their health totals are, Batman's is probably smack dab in the middle, Wonder Woman is the upper echelon of health. So they're saying, screw it, I have health to spare, so let's swing all day. Whereas if their health totals were on the lower end of the pool, you would have to decide, am I willing to sacrifice my life to gain this advantage, and is it a worthwhile advantage? They might not do that as often, and that might be another way of just slowing them down. If you wanted to keep them as 2 charge leaders with attack, you could potentially do that by dropping their health enough where the attack is a conscious decision at all times of the risk-reward factor. Am I willing to put myself at a position where I am more easily defeated in exchange for killing a recruit and gaining this massive tempo/board advantage? And I think that is an avenue that I'd really want to see them explored a bit. Obviously, there are other balancing things that they can do in terms of specifically Wonder Woman, Batman, but just kind of attacking leaders in general. You see it a bit more, like the second tier Wonder Woman, Batman is things like Harley in like an aggro deck. It's less of an issue with things like Aquaman and your Green Lanterns and all those things. But even those, Aquaman is getting a bit of an attack, but also gets a recruit on the board that gets stronger and stronger every time he attacks. So the kind of same question can be applied to him, is he's gaining this board advantage and he's getting this board presence and he's getting these buffs and he also gets an attack and then he can attack into your recruit. if Aquaman had less health, being able to use that attack to double gain advantage, because he gets a recruit, which gets buffed, so that's one part of an advantage. And then if he takes away one of your recruits with his leader attack, that is a double advantage. If all of the attacking leaders, or most of the best attacking leaders, had lower health in general, I think it would be a really interesting decision that you had to make. And then furthermore, I think it would serve as a buff to Superman, to make him stand out, really. Because right now, don't get me wrong, I think Superman is solid, but just solid doesn't really cut it, especially when you're talking about might leaders. Solid doesn't cut it in comparison to when you have to decide, do I play Superman or do I play Aquaman or Wonder Woman? If attacking leaders had less health in general and had to use that health as a resource more conservatively or more carefully, I think Superman's ability of being invincible while swinging would really make him stand out. It would then say, I have this attacking leader, and his value is that he ignores the downside of your health being a resource while attacking. I think it would serve to make Superman even more interesting and even better. So I really, really hope that as balance changes start coming out, and especially in the more difficult balance scenarios, because I completely, confirm, less so for Wonder Woman. I honestly think Wonder Woman's ability at 3 charges would still be very strong. But Batman probably gets a little bit on the weak side if he were to become 3 charges. So like Batman, you could easily drop his health total, especially so because Batman is going to be played with Alfred and the grapnel guns and constantly generating bandages, and he can constantly be healing himself with those bandages and the gadget generation. I think Batman could afford to have his health total dropped a good amount, and then you really need to play into that bandage playstyle or decide, am I going to take these swings or not? Do I have a bandage to follow up with after I take these swings? Like, that could be a good avenue of balancing something like Batman without needing to up his charges or take away his attack, and it really then makes him lean even more into his gadget gameplay. We've talked a lot about the gadgets last episode, so I don't want to rehash a lot of that. But I think despite tactics as a whole having a lot of gadget identity, I think anything they can do to make Batman kind of synonymous with gadgets even more so would also be a good thing, and also would keep his power level at a pretty respectable level, which I think is a pretty good place to be. So, leader health pools, TLDR, although you probably already listened all the way through this point, but if you are skimming, leader health pools, awesome balance knob to turn. I want to see them tweak those more often. Honestly, if you play any Hearthstone, or if you play Hearthstone Battlegrounds, one of my favorite things they ever did was, in Battlegrounds, they gave armor values to the leaders. Because in Hearthstone, everybody has 30 health, and that's not something they tweak. But in Battlegrounds, they realized some of the weaker leaders needed a little bit extra health. And rather than tweaking the health totals, since that was just kind of core Hearthstone code, they decided to add armor, which essentially gives the leaders additional health totals. And they ebb and flow those armor totals based on kind of the win rates of the various leaders. So I think DC Dual Force doing that, even if it's like a seasonal thing where, let's say, I don't know how long seasons are going to be in Dual Force, but let's say a ladder season is, a month or 2 months. If in this given month there's this one leader pair that is just dominating the ladder at all times, they easily next month can say, all right, these 2 leaders a bit too good, we're going to drop their health total 1 or 2 points. These 2 leaders, they were our least played leaders this month, let's bump their health totals up 1 or 2 points. Those are the kinds of values that can usually be fixed in like a hot fix patch without needing to do a full game release. So they can constantly be tweaking these values up and down to kind of create meta shifts without needing to nerf and buff cards as well, which is another really awesome thing that I hope they are planning on doing. Finally, final topic of today's episode is I want to talk about the tempo situation as a whole in Dual Force. People are familiar with tempo in card games, and tempo is kind of the name of the game in Dual Force right now. You see it a lot where, especially with the way the resource system works, if you don't draw bronzes, a lot of the times you just you see people conceding on turns 2 or 3. or they play out their early plays and you have the perfect counter, you wipe their board on turn 2 or 3, they concede. A lot of that is, I don't think people are very comfortable or been in situations where they need to make those comebacks yet, so I'm not saying the game is pure snowball, but tempo is so important in Dual Force. Both getting an early presence on the board, being able to navigate and manage those tempo swings. We see a lot of, we've already talked about, your Batman, your Wonder Woman, things like that, or your Harley aggro decks. Those cards get so many cards on the board early, and then they are adding onto their tempo and value advantage by using their leader's attack to wipe out your recruits, thus increasing their board advantage, making you fall further behind on tempo. And then you need to use your leader abilities to regain that lost tempo. So in general, in Dual Force, tempo is the name of the game. And there's a couple reasons for that. The biggest one is what we were just talking about. Leaders are a massive additional source of tempo in Dual Force. You compare it to something like the hero powers in Hearthstone, where Hearthstone's hero powers can gain you some tempo in terms of if you had no other card to play or you wanted to conserve your resources, you can, pay for your hero power and, maybe get 1 damage ping with like the mage hero power, or the druid hero power gets you 1 attack and 1 armor so you can swing into something. The thing with the Hearthstone hero powers, though, are they are well, at this point now, Hearthstone's been out for like 10 years, so now they are very overcosted, so they're very inefficient. It's just kind of a thing that you do if you don't have a better option, whereas the leader abilities in Dual Force are very, very strong. So you're getting that additional, I don't need to use my cards, for a massive tempo swing. The tempo swings vary depending on leader, but if you've got your Batmans, your Wonder Womans, your Harleys, to a lesser extent, your Aquamans, they're creating so much value in tempo that if I'm ahead on the board and you're trying to come back, let's say I had an awesome turn 1 and 2, you're kind of behind. You played your bronze turn 1, turn 2 you only had a second bronze, so you didn't get to play 2 cards out. You're a little bit behind on the board. I'm ahead of you, and then I also proc my leader abilities. Now, that kind of slight tempo advantage that you would see in a lot of card games has become kind of like a tempo avalanche, where you are massively behind and you might not ever come back now because I can use my leaders to clear your recruits, and then I continue developing my board. So instead of having to trade with my recruits, now I have double the board and you're empty, and then even if you proc your leader abilities next turn, you're just going to take out 1 or 2 of my recruits and you're never really going to regain the board that way. So leader abilities as a whole are the single biggest source of tempo in Dual Force. The other thing to talk about is the most common way of regaining tempo, or if you're playing something like a control deck where you are intentionally falling behind, not intentionally, but part of your game plan is falling behind so that you can kind of make gigantic tempo swings later in the game. The thing to think about in Dual Force is we don't have a lot of those options. What I mean by that is, especially in Dual Force, where the way the resource system works, in general, you can play 2 resource cards per turn plus your free cards. But in general, your free cards are really just going to be gadgets over in tactics. Occasionally, if you're playing aggro, you'll be playing like your Kite Man. If you're playing your Shazam, you maybe generate a Lightning Bolt. But in general, you want to play cards with costs in your deck because those cards are on average better besides certain scenarios. So you're going to play around 2 cards per turn. If I spend one of my resources, which is a card, and one of my actual resources being, your bronze, your silver, your gold, I'm spending essentially 2 pieces, but in general, we're going to call it a resource. So half of my turn, if I spend that removing one of your recruits on the board, I did not gain enough tempo back because I lost a card, I lost my resource, I am not developing my board in return, and all I'm doing is taking away half of your turn. But it's not like I was able to kill multiple things and make that comeback. So single target removal in Dual Force, I feel like in general, needs to have an additional boost onto it. Besides something like I think the bronze ones are somewhat decently suited because they answer a lot of bronze recruits. But the problem is they don't scale into the late game well. And then a lot of the mid game single target removals that are damage based don't have the highest damage totals. So you have like Sonic Cannon that deals 3 damage as a silver, which is a little bit weak. But the plus side is it does draw a card. Those pieces of removal that draw a card, you still don't gain a ton of tempo back, but you at least are refilling your cards, which are a resource that you need as well. So those are typically the ones that feel quote unquote the best to play, but they're still not really up to snuff in terms of being able to regain that tempo on the board in general. And then the other thing to think about is AoE in Dual Force. Now, in general, I'm not a fan of when AoE is too good in card games because you wind up in those situations where control decks do nothing, they do nothing, they do nothing, they just slap a board clear down, and then they start playing their big stuff, and then maybe they slap another board clear down. I don't like when AoE is too good. I think we are slightly in the other direction, though, where AoE as a whole is a bit too weak. You have Culling, which I think is probably the single best feeling AoE in the game. It's not super strong because 3 attack or less is still not going to hit a ton of stuff. It's going to hit almost nothing in the late game, but in general, if you play it on like your silver bronze turn, it's probably going to wipe most of the board. And you could probably set it up with things like Tear Gas or Traumatize where you can hit some better targets in the mid to late game. Culling is one of the only ways that I found really is that good at regaining a ton of tempo. Because then you have things like Massacre, which should be like the definitive board clear, and it does its job okay. I would call it like mid in general. But also, Aura is so prevalent in Dual Force that a lot of those AoEs don't even hit your opponent's cards because they're just going to soak it with Aura. So Massacre is not as good as it could be. And then you have the other damage-based ones. I forget what they are. There's one silver that does 3 damage to everything, and there's a gold version of it that does 3 damage to just your enemies. But a lot of those, especially in a world where Wonder Woman's buffing things health and things like that, 3 damage to everything is not enough most of the time. That silver is probably only used as like an aggro card to deal 3 to each leader because it's not going to clear the board. And then spending a gold resource to deal 3 to everything is like, that's not going to cut it either. And if I want to deal damage to the leaders, I'll just use something like Living Lightning or something like that. I think in general, we need to identify which factions are going to have board clears and buff them up a bit. It seems like in general, they want board clears to be in Tyranny. So maybe Tyranny needs one, maybe Massacre needs to go through Aura or something, especially since it's an ultimate. And then maybe Energy has some damage-based board clears that maybe the values get tweaked up or down a little bit. Your other one you have is like Mass Arrests, which is, again, okay. It doesn't actually get rid of anything. The only time you're gaining enough tempo is if your board was close to empty and your opponent basically had a full board. Then you're kind of gaining some tempo, but even then, you use Mass Arrests, you give your opponent all of their cards back, and then all of your cards get bounced to hand. You spent your gold resource on Mass Arrests, which means all you can follow up with is getting 1 silver or bronze onto the board, so you now have 1 recruit left. Your opponent now has all of their good cards back in hand and a full slate of resources. They can play 2 recruits to your 1. They basically got board advantage right back. So as a whole, I think AoE needs some work. And I think the kind of on the topic of tempo this is why the Lantern cards and the Lantern archetype as a whole doesn't really kind of hit right now. In Dual Force, tempo is so massively important that all of the Lantern cards in general are cards that lose tempo when you play them. Unless you have that extra bronze resource, whether it is your Howl turn, which is only every 3 turns, so you can't really count that enough, because what are you going to get that, 2, maybe 3 times per game? So you don't gain enough tempo there to rely on Howl. Or if you're using like Chase-Alon or the Green Lantern Battery or Stargirl, there's a couple other ways, but in general, you don't have that extra resource consistently enough to where you can count on that as part of your game plan. So if I'm playing my normal turn with 2 resources and I play 1 Green Lantern card and I activate their ability, which consumes my second of 2 resources, I am losing a ton of tempo. And in general, the Lantern cards don't do enough to gain your tempo back. What I mean by that is like Chip, the bronze one, gives you +1/+1 and aura on another recruit, which is okay. Like that's solid in general, but not solid enough to eat up the second half of your turn. Or Jessica and the other guy, Baez, or I can't remember the other guy's name. The +3 attack and +3 health ones, like those are solid if you have the extra resource, but if you're paying that in your bronze turn, you're going to be massively behind. They don't get enough health to trade with all of these things, especially like getting the health one goes up to a 3/5. Like in general, Wonder Woman plus their weakest card trades into that, and now they have 2 cards that they're going to play, and they gain the advantage on you. So lanterns either need more lanterns that gain tempo when played, or more ways to consistently have that additional resource. The difficulty with that is the resource in general is not tied to just lanterns. So if you make that resource too easy to get, what you'll probably just wind up seeing is people using it to play like an aggro deck or something like that rather than use it for lanterns. So I think more things along the lines of like Chase-A-Lon, where you have to play the Green Lantern to get the extra resource, is the kind of thing you want to see. And I also think that's why, in general, the 2 lanterns, if you think about all of the lanterns that you play, and I'm somebody who really likes playing the lantern cards, if you think about all of the lanterns, the 2 that you play that you don't necessarily feel that bad about playing, and you can maybe add Hal Jordan into that list as well, the one that doubles himself when he's played, but I'm not really going to include him on that list. He's just kind of a decent, like, chunky card. But you can maybe consider him as one of 3. But the 2 lanterns that you play that feel good to play most of the time, basically every time, are Kyle Rayner and John Stewart. And what is the reason for that? They both gain tempo. Kyle Rayner puts the doubled attack kaiju on the board, which, yes, you can just ignore the kaiju and attack Kyle Rayner directly, but a lot of people don't use single target removal because it's weak, so you can hide Kyle behind the kaiju. But also, if they can't kill, just target down Kyle with removal. You have now played Kyle plus a big body. So you're getting 2 bodies for that 1 additional resource, which means you paid 2 resources and you got 2 bodies. That is fair, especially if the second body is a buffed body. So it's like a conditional second body, but you're still getting tempo on the board. John Stewart, similar situation. You play the second resource and you get his ability, which allows him to deal his attack as damage to anything on the board, which means you can use John Stewart as a form of removal or a form of pushing additional face damage. You gain tempo when you play him on the board if you use that to destroy an enemy recruit. So those 2 lanterns stand out to me as these are cards that gain tempo, so they fit into the game as a whole right now, so they are playable. Whereas the rest of the lanterns don't quite hit that. I guess Kilowog can almost hit that, but he requires you to really have like a board of lanterns already to really gain tempo on play. A lot of the lanterns they want to get tempo in the future based on their kind of incremental advantage that they're getting, but that doesn't really work out in practice a lot of the time. So that's a long way of saying tempo is king in this game, and until there's enough ways to make bigger tempo swings, it's going to be too hard to keep up with a lot of the tempo that leaders can generate. So you really have to make sure that your cards and your board presence is doing the work for you and you're staying ahead of those leaders. So that's all I've got today, guys. Thank you guys for listening to episode 2 of the DC Dual Force podcast. If you guys have any questions that you'd like to add or have answered on episode 3, drop them down either down below in the comment section, via email, Discord, however you want to get in touch with me. I do want to start adding community Q&A segments to this at some point in the future as well. If you have any topics you'd like to see covered in episode 3, you can also drop those in any way you'd like to get in touch with me as well. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching or listening or however you are consuming this podcast. And we'll see you guys next week for episode 3. Have a great week.